How is it possible that a team like Ferrari, with a car new to 99%, is so far from the head rhythm? What is really failing on SF-25? From the beginning, the SF-25 was presented as a massive evolution with respect to SF-24, but that description barely did justice. Internally, Ferrari defined it as a car new to 99%, something unusually bold in a sport that penalizes poorly calculated structural jumps. Key components were redesigned, the aerodynamic approach was changed, and a completely different architecture was implemented in the suspensions. The objective was to overcome the limitations of the previous car, which, although it had been competitive, suffered in high-load circuits and had limited margins of evolution. Already in the first preseason tests, warning signs were perceived. Although the car offered a decent performance in race simulations and showed good figures in the wind tunnel, its track behavior did not reflect that potential. The pilots reported instability in rapid curves, traction difficulties, and, most worrying, an inability to maintain a constant driving height without compromising the integrity of the flat background. These problems were initially attributed to a lack of tuning and did not ignite all the alarms. But as the races began, it was clear that the symptoms were not passengers, but part of a structural failure in the philosophy of the car. The most disconcerting for Ferrari is that their simulations continue to offer promising data. The car in theory should be up to the leaders. But in practice, every weekend is transformed into a damage containment test. The adjustments made after Carrera have failed to stabilize the behavior of the SF-25, and that has forced the team to rethink all its technical approach. Far from being a candidate for the title, the SF-25 has become an urgent problem that needs immediate solution. The disenchantment is palpable not only in the garages, but also in the faces of the engineers and the increasingly raw comments of their pilots. But Serra did not have the ideal time to get involved in the project since its conception. When the team was integrated, the design of the SF-25 was already advanced. His role, therefore, was more of the course of the original author. Even so, he assumed the total responsibility of the most delicate decisions that were taken during the final phase of development, especially the most radical. Implement a pull rod scheme in the front and rear suspension. This architecture, popularized by Red Bull in recent years, and also adopted by McLaren, was considered the key to unlocking new levels of aerodynamic performance. But like everything in Formula One, its success is not guaranteed by technical fashion, but by the thorough execution of the concept. The pull rod scheme, unlike the traditional pushrod, allows a lower geometry of the suspension train, which improves airflow under the car, reduces the center of gravity, and potentially increases the efficiency of the diffuser. On paper, it was a significant improvement, especially for a team that was looking for every extra square centimeter of aerodynamic load. But what was not completely contemplated was that pull rod, if it is not implemented with an extremely rigid and well-calibrated structure, can become a weak point in the interaction of the car with the flat background. The platform promised an impressive aerodynamic load, exceptional traction levels, and a greater capacity of setup. But all that was conditioned to a structural rigidity that, in practice, was never achieved. Serra was the first to recognize the problem. It was not the aerodynamics that failed, but the inability of the car to operate in the ideal window of that aerodynamics, a window that the rear suspension system critically compromised. The challenge to Serra now is not only technical but strategic. Modifying the suspension architecture in the middle of the season is an extremely complex task. It implies redesigning key structural elements, recalibrating the balance of the car, and, potentially, altering the general setup philosophy that pilots have been trying to tame for months. But the most worrying thing is that, at this point, Ferrari has no choice. If the team wants to prevent 2025 from remembered as a lost year, Serra's intervention must be immediate, decisive, and without margin of error. Because if he fails, not only his legacy will be marked, but also Ferrari's competitive future in an era that is becoming increasingly ruthless. In a modern Formula One car, the flat background is one of the most vital areas to generate aerodynamic load, especially from the implementation of the soil effects in the current technical era. Any oscillation, contact, or degradation in this part compromises not only the performance, but also the legality of the car according to the technical regulations of the FIA. Ferrari, in his eagerness to keep the car as close to the ground as possible to take advantage of the maximum soil effect, ran into a fundamental mechanical limitation. The SF-25 could not hold that height without repeatedly hitting the asphalt. In ideal conditions, a stable car generates an aerodynamic mattress under the flat background that hits the circuit without touching it. But when the suspension is not rigid enough, that balance is broken. The car begins to range vertically, and each impact with the asphalt wears the wooden plate that covers the lower part of the car, a critical regulatory piece known as skid block. This phenomenon not only implies a loss of aerodynamic load due to the interruption of the flow under the car, but also leads to a direct penalty if the iron wears out below the legal limit. That was precisely what happened in the Grand Prix of China, where Lewis Hamilton was disqualified after a post-carrier inspection that revealed an excess of wear in his lower plate. The sanction not only eliminated the points he had achieved that day, but also exposed a structural problem that cannot be corrected only with configuration settings. The irony is brutal. The wind tunnel data showed that the SF-25 had one of the highest levels of aerodynamic load of the paddock, at least in simulation. But on the track, that potential became a threat against the car itself. To avoid more sanctions, Ferrari was forced to raise the height of the car in the following races. This decision, although necessary to comply with the regulation, had an immediate aerodynamic cost. By increasing height, air flow under the car becomes more turbulent, the soil effect decreases and performance in high-speed curves is lost. It is a vicious circle. If Ferrari lowers the car, risks everything with possible sanctions. If you upload it, you lose half a second by return in front of your rivals. The situation worsens with fuel load. In the first laps of race with the heaviest car, vertical oscillations intensify. The background hits with more force and more frequency, and the degradation of the material becomes critical in a matter of minutes. This forces pilots to adapt their driving style, avoid aggressive pianos and minimize sudden maneuvers in rapid curves. Hamilton and Leclerc have had to pilot thinking about keeping the bottom of the car rather than attacking. And in Formula 1, when defensive pilots from the first turn, you are doomed to lose. The critical point of wear has redefined the way Ferrari must address not only every race weekend, but also its long-term development strategy. This problem is not something that is solved with a simple aerodynamic update. It requires a deep review of the mechanical behavior of the car, a solution that goes directly by redesigning the rear suspension, recalibrating the stiffness parameters and possibly modifying the chassis itself if it is determined that the problem is structural. In summary, the SF-25 is a car trapped between the promise of its potential and the physical limit of its platform. And meanwhile, every return that makes it under the constant threat of a new disqualification or another weekend ruined by a failure that is not seen, but that defines everything. Loïc Serra, as a technical director, has before him a colossal task. It is not just about introducing new pieces, but about reprogramming the essence of the car in full season. Under ideal conditions, a team develops its concept of suspension at least 12 months in advance, proves it in dynamic banks, simulates it in virtual environments and validates it on the track with multiple iterations. Ferrari, on the other hand, has a few weeks to check planes, manufacture parts, mount them, test them in free practices and expect them to work in real race conditions without compromising the reliability or balance of the car. It is a surgical precision game but executed with a time saw in the throat. This new suspension is not just an attempt to fix the broken. It represents the only possible way to save a season that promised glory and so far has only brought disappointments. If the new rear architecture manages to contribute the rigidity that SF-25 needs to stay stable at low height, Ferrari may finally release the entire potential of its flat bottom, exploit the benefits of the soil effect and reduce the margin of oscillation that has been wearing the car both physically and in its reputation. With it, they also expect to reduce the drag generated by track corrections, which would improve the race rhythm without compromising the passage through curve, one of the biggest weak points of the current car. But even if the solution works technically, Ferrari cannot afford another failure in execution. The pressure on the equipment is maximum. The arrival of Hamilton had to mark the beginning of a new era, but without a competitive car, its signing runs the risk of being reduced to a symbolic act without results. Charles Leclerc, on the other hand, has begun to show frustration, not only because of the performance, but for the inability of the team to give him a tool that allows him to fight equally against the leaders of the championship. A new technical failure or an erroneous implementation of the redesign could have devastating consequences. A fall in the general classification, an internal break between pilots and engineers, and even a shake in the direction of the team. Ferrari's 2025 season has gone from euphoria to skepticism in a matter of weeks. What began as a promise of rebirth, driven by the arrival of a legend such as Lewis Hamilton and the strategic incorporation of a technical brain such as Loïc Serra, has become a desperate struggle against concept errors, the physical limits of the car and the crushing pressure of an expectation that no longer expects, which it demands. The SF-25 has so far been a case of wasted potential. A car that had the ingredients on paper to fight championships, but that on the track has been the living representation of a broken promise. However, not everything is still lost. The rear suspension redesign marks a turning point. Not only for what it represents technically, but for the message you send. Ferrari recognizes the problem, assumes its responsibility, and is willing to rebuild what is necessary to return to the forehead. And this is where you, as a spectator and passionate about this sport, what do you think of Ferrari's technical decisions? Do you think the bet on the pull rod scheme was a mistake or a vision that needs more time? Is Loïc Serra at the height of the challenge, or has it been launched to a situation without a margin of real maneuver? Leave your vision in the comments.